The big idea for this part of the lecture is to compare Stanford as a sort of Acropolis to the Acropolis at Athens that was built during the 450s. Probably the most important ideas here are that I want you to be aware of is that any college campus or any religious campus, like for instance, a place that has a church and a baptistry and maybe even other buildings that are associated with religion, would surround themselves, first of all, with as much land as possible. And I think that sounds like a weird thing to say, but basically what I'm talking about is it allows for a dramatic setting for the main buildings that are the most important, and it amplifies their meaning. So the placement of buildings in space in a landscape also mean a lot of stuff. So at Stanford, they've got these long drives that lead to big buildings, and at the end of the big building, at the end of these long drives, like Palm Drive, in this instance, there's a circle, there's an oval, and you travel around it, and you see a bunch of beautiful buildings and some really nice gardening and architecture. So any campus that you go to is basically the buildings that are on them are placed in such a way to give them a little bit more meaning and to make them more important, okay? So the Acropolis in Athens does the same thing. It places it on a mountain, okay? It commemorates an important battle, and so they're really putting everything they have in the Athenian government, all their money, into this beautiful building. It also has a bunch of things that, for instance, every campus has. For instance, it has an amphitheater, which is for entertainment. And the same thing is on Stanford's campus, that there are theaters, there are sports complexes. The Olympics were important to Athenians. So sports, entertainment, plays, things that we would think of as movies and television, they're cohesive. What they do is if everybody has seen the same movie or the same play, right? Everybody has a story that they can share. And sometimes those plays and those films and that kind of thing also sort of push an agenda, and the agenda sometimes has to do with the morality of that culture. And I think that that's really part of what happens in any kind of religious or educational institution. The other thing that you have on these sort of campuses or acropoli are things like public art. And the public art that we look at is meant to amplify or magnify the main thesis or big idea behind the university or the religious complex. And so, for instance, the Rodin sculpture from the 1800s that we're looking in the upper right-hand corner represents the Burghers of Calais. And that was commissioned by the town of Calais in the 1800s to commemorate an event that had to do with certain townspeople giving up their lives or being willing to give up their lives and their rights, and they actually were willing to sacrifice themselves. So they're ideal citizens. The ideal citizens for the Athenians are these sort of good-looking men on horseback, which ties a little bit into military stuff, and also probably shows the beauty of the people. So when Rodin did his sculpture, he's trying to show you how rough and beautiful these people are. And in the same thing with Athenian relief sculpture. The other thing that they all have are what we call sort of grand vistas or parade ways, that kind of stuff. And in this instance, we look at Stanford. They have got this driveway called Palm Drive. And it's really, really lovely. As you go down it, there are these palm trees on either side that look almost like Greek columns. And if you go to Athens, well, they don't do it anymore, but in the 5th century, they had every couple of years something called the Panathenaic Procession. And what they would do is they would travel all the way around the base of the Acropolis, and they would end up on the front steps, and it was like this beautiful funneling in this vista. And so what I'm suggesting is that architecture is almost like a stage set. It's being designed to sort of push your buttons and make you feel impressed by the size and the grandeur of the buildings that are around you. So when you're coming down Palm Drive, you end up at the end in the oval, and there's this beautiful church, the Memorial Church. When you are at the end of the walk, all the way up this gigantic hill or mountain in Athens, you end up first in an art museum. And I think that's really kind of interesting because it's almost the reverse of what we have in the 20th and 21st centuries. Or the church is the biggest vista point on Stanford, whereas in the Acropolis, the first thing that you saw was this thing called the Propylaea, and it had an art museum in it called the Pinacoteca. The palm trees, I think, are almost sort of like columns on either side of the road. And you would zoom in, and the first thing tourists do when they get there is they stand in front of this sort of symmetrical vista. So symmetry, meaning that if you cut the scene in half, it's visually balanced equally on either side. There's nothing heavier visually on either side. People love that, and they stand right in the center of these archways, which is also a reference back to classical Rome, where they used triumphal arches and things like that. And then you move through, and there's the church through this sort of ornate stone. It's meant to mime or mimic almost Gothic and classical architecture. And people stand in front of this thing and get their photos taken, and it's the focal point, or it was in some ways, of campus life, is this religious temple to Christ, right? I think that the same thing kind of happened in Athens. The Parthenon was the center of the universe for them. And just to jog off to the side for us, there are other things that they do have there. For instance, there's a mausoleum, and there was actually a graveyard with markers there in Athens that we're going to take a look closer at the art museum. And the art museum is located way off in the upper right-hand corner here, and we go down a large vista and we visit the building, okay? The building, when you first look at it, aren't you impressed? I mean, it's super big, right? It's got these Greek columns. So one of the things that you probably feel immediately upon seeing it is that it's a temple. It's a religious place, almost like the White House or some of the buildings in Washington use this same sort of vernacular of architecture that has to do with columns, right? And made out of stone. It even has white sculptures out front. Then you look up in the entablature of the building, which is basically the upper levels of the building, and you see these wonderful mosaics that are almost like paintings, but they portray classical stuff, so stuff that's related to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And the things that they heroicize, or these are almost like posters that are meant to push your buttons and make you think, what am I going to see inside this museum? You have Rome, okay? Rome and its columns, and it's the antique Rome. It's not contemporary Rome. You have painting, and of course you have architecture. And architecture is the setting. It's the jewelry box in which the art goes in. But it can be jewelry itself, right? It's just as beautiful in some ways if you're interested in that kind of stuff. So the Cantor Center uses a vocabulary that says, I'm a Greek temple, and I contain jewels and treasures inside, and here are some sort of posters on the sides of the buildings that tell you what kinds of beautiful things that you'll see inside this building. Well, the exterior of the building is also meant to show, you know, you can congratulate yourself if you know this stuff. So you walk up to the front of the building and you see that the columns and what's on top of the columns, which is that sort of cap on the top of them, is called a capital. They're different between the Parthenon and between Stanford, but they both have columns. And if you were really educated, right, if you were one of these 19th century guys and maybe a 21st century guy, because I'm trying to help you out here, there's this idea that they're referencing antique classical orders of architecture, and there are rules you have to follow with each one of those things. And in fact, there's even some weird sort of gender issues that have to do with columns. For instance, the Doric order, if you look at it, which is the Parthenon's order, has a very simple capital. The simple capital that Abacus and the Echinus that we're looking at, the Echinus is just modeled on the dome of actually a sea urchin. Then it has this entablature above it, which is divided up into these sort of weird little things, triglyphs. Tri means three, glyph means mark, so it's just 3 marks. And then a metope, which usually has a little sculpture in it. And above that is a frame, and in Italian, the word for frame is cornice, cornice, okay? And if you look at the building on the right-hand side, that's clearly Ionic, okay? It's got the column on it, the capital, kind of looks a bit like the capital letter I, and that's how I always learned it. But I think an interesting difference between the Doric order and the Ionic order are that the Doric order has a continuous frieze in its entablature, which means you can put a continuing sculpture or letters up there or writing. There's no divisions of those triglyphs. It also is wearing a pair of shoes. It's got a base on it. Now, the sort of RuPaul or Carmen Miranda of the orders is the next order, the Corinthian, and the Romans even took it to the limit. So the Corinthian order has a basket of acanthus leaves, which are just basically dandelion leaves that they used to make salads out of. On top of the capital, it has a couple of volutes and it's wearing shoes. Okay, so if you learn the differences between this ornamentation, when you go to buildings anywhere, like in San Francisco or any place that has antique buildings, you'll see that they emulated a lot of these basic orders in especially Victorian architecture. So that means in the top from the 19th century from the museum, these little panels are almost like the metapiece between the triglyphs on the Parthenon. And they're meant to tell you a story. In Athens, during the 5th century, when they were building the Parthenon, they really understood architectural orders in such a way, they were so sophisticated about it, that they were able to know the differences of subtle differences, at least with some of the architects. I don't think most common people like you and I would have thought, oh my God, that's an outrageous thing he's doing. But in this instance, on the Parthenon, they have on the exterior, it's a Doric order, and it has those metapiece and triglyphs. But inside, there's a second layer of columns, okay, that were almost like the wall against the cella in the interior. And it has what's called a continuous frieze. And that continuous frieze that we're looking at probably represents what's called the Panathenaic Procession. There's a lot of debate about this kind of stuff, but basically the Panathenaic Procession was something that went on every couple of years. Everybody came in a parade. There's also some interpretations of this frieze that it basically represents a legendary king and his daughter just sort of putting this chiton on top of a sculpture. It's a complex story, but I actually think it's just meant to be ideal citizens, and that it probably isn't even really telling a story, that it's just decoration. Of course, someone's going to write me a nasty letter for that. But basically, the continuous frieze is like a parade that probably represents something like the Panathenaic Procession. And there's a bunch of people who are in wet drapery. They have beautiful proportions. The horses are beautiful, and they're riding across this frieze towards one goal. So you can follow it all the way around in one direction. Now, kind of an innovative thing is that the continuous frieze is slightly different from the outer frieze, which is the Doric order. And I want to just point out so that you can see the difference, that there are these triglyphs here and metapiece. And these triglyphs and metapiece that I'm pointing to actually are sort of containment devices. They're an extension from actually putting the ends when these buildings were made out of wood. They actually had structures that were made out of wood that looked like that, and now they're making them out of stone. But the metapiece were usually painted or had some sort of ceramic clay, and were meant to keep the birds out because there were these columns between. And so it made a nice little square decorative motif, and so you can put a little scene in those. And the scenes that are on the exterior of the Parthenon are actually of a battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. The Lapiths and the Centaurs are basically, the Lapiths are thought to be the perfect people. In some ways, they're the embodiment of the Athenians, okay? And it's from an ancient Greek myth in which the Lapiths were having a wedding. They invited the Centaurs, who are half man, half horse. So essentially, they're half-assed, if you think about it, right? And they come to the wedding, and they get drunk. And, you know, have you ever heard in wine is truth, in vino veritas? Some people pronounce it in vino veritas, whatever. In vino veritas, basically means in wine is truth, and their true nature took over. They became frat boys and tried to just basically, they got a little wild at the party. And so the metopes that represent this, probably a balance between orderly or the rational and the irrational, also could represent how the Athenians felt about the Persians, that the Persians are terrible people because they invaded them. But the continuous narrative frieze that's above the, in the Ionic entablature above Doric columns, probably represents the best that Athens has to offer. All of the ideal citizens with their beautiful bodies, with the they're bringing libations up to Athena, and then they finally arrive and they're presenting her with a garment to clothe her every year. And every one of the citizens has obviously gone to 24-hour fitness quite a lot. And when you finally get to the females, an interesting little detail is the females are almost always completely clothed, but because we want to see the anatomy underneath, but we still want to be pious, what they'll do is they'll use wet drapery style. And to augment it, to make it look a little bit more realistic, there's a pose that comes up quite a bit in sculpture, and we're going to be looking at that a little bit more. It's a counterbalancing of weight at the hips, which is called the Contrapposto Stance. So you can actually kind of see the female form or the male form defined by the drapery, and then you can also see that sway of weight at the hips in which you're standing with all of your weight on one leg and one knee is slightly bent. Now, if we move closer to the museum and we kind of look a little bit closer at some of the details, then you can kind of hack it or decipher it a little bit. So above the Ionic and column capitals, which are actually not truly Ionic, you'll see just behind it are these things called coffers, which are, they're made out of stone here, but they're actually vestiges of when they would make things like this out of wood. And so above that, we also see some writing, and it's just basically Leland Stanford Museum. And this relates a little bit to, for instance, the Pantheon, because on the top of the Pantheon, there's an inscription that says, Agrippa costet fecit, or something like that, which basically says, Agrippa built me. In fact, he didn't, because what happened was Agrippa, I think in the 1st century BCE, had built some buildings, and one of them was called the Pantheon. And then Hadrian came along around 125, something like that, and he rebuilds the Pantheon. But so what he wants to do is he puts Agrippa's name on it to give it an authority. And that's the same thing here. If you put someone who's dead and important on the entablature of a building, it means something, right? It means they're important. The columns also sort of have high heels, and they're those high-heeled shoes that we're talking about. And they also reference back to another really important building from the Acropolis of Athens, which is called the Nike Temple. Some people pronounce it Nike. And the Nike Temple basically is a small temple that would have held a statue that had wings coming out of its back, because Nike is the goddess of victory. And so she would have been one of the first buildings that you see, and there would have been this little temple that you could stop off at on your way in to see the Parthenon. Now, what I'd like to do is move a little bit closer into the building, and what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the ornamentation above these doors first. The doors themselves make reference to a series of doors that we're going to be studying in just a little bit by a guy named Lorenzo Ghiberti. And Ghiberti created these bronze doors for Florence Cathedral. And they told biblical stories. These doors actually tell you, they're like picture postcards of important places to go. So let's go back to the Parthenon for just a second. The pediment, which is that triangular portion of the Parthenon, has a couple of little figures in it that are reclining females. This is a reconstruction drawing that's been colorized, and yeah, they actually painted their sculptures. If you had seen it probably in its original state, you'd probably plots, you know. But these 3 sculptures are these 3 goddesses, probably designed or sculpted by a guy named Phidias around 450 BCE. You can see they're all in a sort of semi-reclining position. And the one on the far right, that becomes, I don't know if it's that exact one, but that pose becomes iconic. It is just a standard pose that everybody takes, and the wet drapery style. So you can almost look through every period of art history and there'll be at least one figure posed like that. And if we look at the doors here and get a little bit closer, you can see that the main figure who's seated in the front there, who obviously is an architect because she's got some kind of square over there, she is posed in that position in wet drapery. So 19th century patrons to the museum, people who are going, would have totally understood the reference. And then just behind her is a sculpture that we're going to see again many times in this class, which is probably a representation of Athena or Minerva. And I just want to point out that I think people get a little too uptight about whether or not they attribute a sculpture to Athena or Minerva or Hera. I think that the Greeks were much more flexible, and if you really study all the different versions of the myths and stuff, they a lot of times contradict each other, so get over it. The doors on the front are modeled after a series of doors by a guy named Lorenzo Ghiberti, who worked in Florence during the late 1400s, early 1500s. And basically, these are the baptistry doors to Florence Cathedral. And so in order to understand what's going to happen next, we need to take a little closer look at these doors and a reference that goes all the way back to Florence.